I was just wondering if you could give me a bit of an outline on what is legitimate interest. I mean, you can store someone's name and where they work, and that's it? Or can you do a little bit more? I mean, how far can we go? I suppose the point being is that executive search is a discrete business. I don't want a list of 200 people who do a function when actually, with a little bit more information, I know who the right 6 are to call, and therefore don't alert the entire industry that a client of mine is looking and they don't want it to. Do you see where I'm coming from? So therefore, can I store the fact that they, some of their work history, just to know, if I'm trying to find someone to manage a business, I don't want to be ringing someone who's only 2 years out of university, and I will only know that by having a little bit of information. So if I could have a rough idea of what legitimate interest covers, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think legitimate interest can be given a fairly broad definition. You've got to look at what you're doing as a business. Now, you're a recruitment organisation, a search organisation. Yes, you have legitimate interest, it seems to me, in collecting kind of that data. Subject to weight, but it's a balancing act. Does that collection of data prejudice the rights and freedoms of the data subject? Could it materially affect them in some way? So there's a balancing act to be taken. And my very legitimate interest is that if you comply with transparency, in other words, candidates know that you've got their data, then that makes it a lot easier to run on legitimate interest because it's about a balance. Again, the initial conversation was all around moving from the concept that this is data which we want, it's our data, to actually accepting that in this regime, it's the rights of the data subject to paramount here. Everybody has a right to control how their personal data is used. That's what the regulation says. So, I mean, you know, the problem in trying to answer the question is it becomes very fact specific. And legitimate interest is the reason we have legitimate interests is that because the legislators realise that you can't rely on consent all the time. If we had to get consent to process every piece of personal data, the whole of our society would grind to a halt. So it's a balancing test between balancing your interests as a search organisation against the interests of the data subject, bearing in mind that you are supposed to be transparent once you've had this data, and taking that into account as well, I would suggest, in the assessment of whether you can rely on that, whether you need to get consent.
If I may just quickly say, this is the point, you see, I think the consent thing is going to prove very tricky for certain firms. For instance, you know, we are in single figures in terms of number of employees. I personally, in my area of specialization, covers about 3,500 people doing that function in Europe. I can't, to contact all these people who are trying to do a job themselves, I can't email them on their work email, obviously, so I have to talk to them and then email them on their personal email, which of course I can't store that. So I have to, is there not an element where we can rely a little bit on this is the basic needs for what we need to do our job in a practical sense? Otherwise, I just can't actually do any business for my clients because I'll be too busy getting approval.
You're asking the $100 million question, which everybody wants to know the answer to. It all comes back to basically you defining your own policy. So nobody's going to say to you, hard and fast, this is what you can, this is what you can't do. Simon has quite rightly said about the balancing test, so you need to understand about that. And you also need to understand about high risk and low risk data. So, for example, if you were holding my data and all you had about me was my name, my job history, would that, you know, even if I didn't know that, if I found that out and I made a data subject access request, would I complain about that? Well, if it was on an appropriate search, I'd probably be quite pleased he'd identified me. However, if you had got some information about me that, you know, been sourcing and everybody that's ever worked with me thinks I'm an absolute nightmare, don't touch her with a barge pole, she's done this, that and the other, then I might have a different view on that. So you really need to understand what you're holding, and you need to assess for your business what is high risk, what is low risk. There will be nothing that's no risk, but you need to define that for your business and to have that documented, and you need to be able to demonstrate you're living by that as well. This morning we did a lot of, we talked a lot about diversity, and if you're holding any sort of special category data, then you need to have explicit consent to hold that. That's not really come up very, very clearly, but if you're doing diversity searches, then you need to have explicit consent from those individuals to hold that sort of information. So there's a way of working. It just involves some work from the business to understand and to assess what your appetite for risk is as well. But the balancing test is a very, very key one in this.
Okay, thank you.
You may also find that some suppliers as well will be providing tools and techniques to enable you to help you with those processes of trying to gain consent or legitimate interest as well. So talk to your suppliers, because they may very well have tools that can aid that process rather than it being an absolute nightmare of an admin task for you.
And I think that's one of the important points with something like legitimate interest, is you do need to do that legitimate interest assessment, which is a relatively formalised process. That there's a lot of support for that online. Legitimate interest is not new, it's been around for some time. But you can't just simply write on a bit of paper, I'm using legitimate interest, everything's fine, because it doesn't necessarily...
Well, you can, but you probably would be asked to prove how you can.
Justify.
It's very much about showing your working. So it's like having the exam question where you've come to an answer. It's no good just writing an answer. You need to show how you got there. And even if the ICO or the regulators don't necessarily agree with your thinking, at least you'll be able to show what you were thinking and the reason behind that. So that's very important.